All right. So the idea that I want to talk about today is to illustrate with with this whole discussion that I've given now several times about the idea of using types to make better, or using the operational semantics and logical form to make better query engines, better query semantics. So that's a kind of downstream application of the ideas. But I haven't talked about how they might impact, computer science or mathematics in terms of upstream development there. So now I want to talk a little bit about the research program from that angle. How it might change things in the sort of the mathematical and scientific arenas. And so to that end, I want to talk a little bit about how we can use these types to provide abstract versions of some commonly used mathematical tools, and in particular tools that are commonly used in physics and geometry to reason about things like notions of space and movement in space. So the in the previous century, there was a kind of explosion at the turn of the previous century. There was a kind of explosion in different notions of geometry. So people realized that and it's very similar to what happened in this century with respect to logic, right? So in the same way that, people realized you could drop excluded middle and get a new kind of logic that had really interesting applications to computers. And then later, Girard came along and said, oh, we can control copying, and that gives you yet a different kind of logic, linear logic, and that allows you to get, have another kind of logic that's more closely related to how computers operate, but also how things that are resource bounded operate. So all of that has an analog in the previous century in terms of geometry. So in geometry, we had this, people said, oh, well, you could drop Euclid's fifth postulate and get all these interesting geometries, right? Riemannian geometry and hyperbolic geometry, all these different flavors of geometry. And suddenly there was this surfeit of geometries, and mathematicians like Klein were looking for ways to unify all these geometries, to find a program which would unify them. So in many ways, what I've been doing with Ladle or with OSLF is to try to, it's like, the logical analog of Klein's program for geometry. I wanted to find a unifying construction which gave you lots and lots, gave you an account of all the different kinds of logics. And so, in the previous century, Klein was looking for a program that gave a unification of the different geometries. And later, Cartan and Erisman and others generalized Klein's program to include the relativistic geometries. So that's just sort of a very, very brief history of geometry. So what happens in terms of those characterizations people first developed this abstract characterization of the notion of a manifold. So a manifold is a particular flavor of topological space onto which you can spray paint these charts. The charts give you a way to locate events, to locate points in the manifold on a grid system, so you can give them coordinates. And there was an important requirement that if two charts overlap, then the behavior in the overlap has to be nice. Essentially, you're demanding that there's a differentiability of the maps that are associated with the mapping from points in the space to their coordinates. So let me just stop there, and because I've now said a whole bunch of things that are a fairly large scope, and I'll just quickly summarize and see if that makes sense. One, in this century, there's been an explosion in logics because people began to realize that if you drop certain characteristics of logic, such as either excluded middle or weakening and contraction, which are the means by which you can copy things, then you get these new logics, and those logics are very, very useful. They're useful for compute. And that sort of historical development led myself and people like me to look for some underlying constructions to organize all these logics, and OSLF can be thought of as an effort to kind of organize all the logics. And there was an analogous thing that happened, towards the beginning and middle of the previous century, where there was a lot of geometries that were developed because people realized that you could relax the Euclidean postulates and get useful geometries. And then people like Klein and Cartan and Erasmus and others provided frameworks to organize the geometries. So that's step one. And then the other thing I did was to talk a little bit about some of the details that go into building some of these unifying constructions in the geometric setting. So does that make sense? People kind of get the gist of what I'm talking about?
Yeah, so far so good.
Yes, makes sense.
Okay, cool. All right. So if I wanted to give a more abstract characterization of this notion of oh, by the way, so a manifold, so this kind of flavor of topological space, together with a this chart system. If you have a bunch of charts that you paint all over this manifold, that's called an atlas. So any one chart is just a mapping from a local region, a neighborhood in the manifold, some open set in the manifold, over to some coordinate system, right? So that's a chart, and then an atlas is a bunch of charts that you can kind of spray paint over your manifold and piece together to get a view of how you can locate points in the space. Right. So what we now some of the consequences of that is that because your coordinate system is, you know, is this super nice Hausdorff space. Like it's got all kinds of incredibly rich properties, making the coordinate system, the location of points in space, be making those maps from points to their coordinates be nice, means that you're kind of imposing a lot of requirements on your space. So the space is gonna start to bear a lot of the characteristics and traits of the Rn, where, you know, by Rn I mean in copies of the real number line in product, or the real numbers in an in-area product of the reals. So that's super constraining if you think about it. In particular, if you wanted to build up a world that was more discrete, you know, came in chunks, as opposed to being infinitely stretchable, such as might be the case if you were insisting that things were computable, then you're kind of out of luck. In general, the topologies that we associate with computable things don't have the good separation properties that you find with Hausdorff spaces. So there's a kind of mismatch between those two ideas. So if you wanted to use these geometric notions over in the world of compute, where, you know, let's say you wanted to build a computational simulation of the universe, right? Then this particular approach to geometric unification might not be a good fit. The question is there a more abstract characterization that would form an impedance match between the intuitions of Klein and Cartan and Erisman, and what we've learned about the world of computing? And so it turns out that with OSLF, we can give a notion of topology. Now, whether or not topology is ultimately the right tool for the job is yet to be seen. There might be deeper notions, but we can certainly give a notion of topology. So in particular, there's a way of viewing topology from a logical perspective. And Steve Vickers, who I had the pleasure to get to know a little bit when I was at Imperial, Steve Vickers wrote a beautiful book, Topology via Logic. And what he said, what he does is he takes the algebraic structure of open sets, the algebraic structure of topology that you put on some set of points, and shows that can be viewed as a kind of logic. And that's a beautiful insight. And that intuition, where you associate opens with formulae, we can use that to allow us to take OSLF and build topologies. So all we do is we insist that you have formulae, a collection of formulae that satisfies the requirements to be a topology. So any finite and or meet, any finite conjunction has got to be part of your collection of formulae. So I'm gonna, you hand me a collection of formulae, and I'm going to check it for these conditions. And if it passes these conditions, then I'm going to say it's a topology. And the conditions, I don't have to give a complete topology. I only ever have to give a basis for a topology. So topologies can be generated from basis of open sets. So I just need to be able to do finite conjunctions, and I need to be able to do arbitrary disjunctions. And once I have this capability, then I can cover the space of points. If my formulae, when disjoined covers the space of points, then I can always throw in the false, which is going to be interpreted as, the empty set of points, and I've got my topology, right? So that's so I can easily pick out sets of formulae that do that. And so if you think about it for a moment, if I were to run OSLF on the space of row calculus programs as my set of points, then topology is, well, what does the topology say? A topology says what are neighborhoods of points. It says, when you have closed structures, right? So there's like, it's got a boundary. Topology says when something is compact, right? So a neighborhood of a row-line program will be things that are structurally similar to that row-line program in some way, or that's going to be, reachable by a certain number of evolutions from that program. So that's the notion of neighborhood that arises from this idea of a topology. Just to give you some intuitions. So we can build up, and of course it doesn't work just for row calculus. You can do the same for lambda. You can do the same for the ambient calculus. You can do the same for pi. You can do the same for the Chinese monoid. Any of these systems, we can run OSLF on, and then we can build topologies using the formulae as our notion of open. Let me just stop there and check in. Is this making sense?
Yeah, I can still follow.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm good.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Cool.
Question.
So, yeah, go ahead.
When you're talking about computable,
Mm-hmm.
you're including continuum, things that are not constructible in finite time?
I mean, you can run OSLF on anything you want. So if you run it on something that's larger than computable, then you can do that. There's nothing that prevents OSLF from operating on those structures.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay. So so now the idea is, so is there a notion of location that I could use to build a chart-like idea, but that doesn't insist that my topology is going to be Hausdorff, that doesn't come with all of this, non-compute like separation structure? So that's the question. And so it turns out that, as I've mentioned many times in the past, the idea of Huet's idea of the zipper fits the bill. So the thought is that a particular term. So again, every program is going to be built, can be thought of as like a syntax tree, right? And so the idea of the zipper is that we can find a location in a tree by knocking a hole in the tree, right? Where you fit the subtree into that tree with a hole in it, right? That pair of the context and the subtree it defines the location of that point where the hole has been knocked. So that's Huet's insight, and that gives you a very, very rigorous notion of location that is related to a notion of derivative. So Klein and McBride showed that there's a notion of derivative that exactly captures these one-hold contexts. So the idea is that we know how to write down a context like that. A one-hold context in OSLF is an arrow. It's one of these rely guarantee arrows. And so we can now collect, so a particular chart would be a context into which you can locate your points. So it's actually going to be a collection of these contexts into which you put your terms. Right. So think about a collection of one-hold contexts and rules about when you're going to glue the terms into those contexts. Right, and each pairing of context and term is going to give you a location. So this collection of contexts is going to give you a chart. And now if you have two collection of contexts, so remember, we can find these contexts as these arrow formulae in OSLF. So now, well, let's say that I have an overlap. Well, what is an overlap? Well, it means that the source of the arrows is the same. And so now they lead off into potentially different directions. So what you want to do is so in other words, you've got some arrow, say phi1 to phi2, and some other arrow phi1 to phi3, right? And so the phi2 and phi3 are potentially different results, right? So
Greg, you're not sharing screen. I don't know if you intended to.
No, I'm not sharing a screen right now because I didn't get a chance to make any slides. So I'm going to rely upon your visualization skills. So come with me on this journey and visualize. So you've got these contexts which you can think of now as arrows in the sense that they take a particular term of a given shape, and when you slot it in, it produces a new term of a new shape. That's what we mean by an arrow. And so if you have two arrows that take the same shape but then produce different shapes, you want to say something about that compatibility. So what you do is you demand that the overall structure has got to contain the union and the meet of the two, so that you can join them up. But so that your list of charts has to contain the union, right? We didn't insist that our list of charts was a topology in any way. So we're going to insist on this, and this is like the differentiability condition. And so now we have a notion of chart and atlas on top of a topology. Is this making sense?
Wouldn't a patchwork chart also be a topology?
The patchwork of charts is going to give you a way to think about your manifold as locally like Rn, right? And similarly here, this patchwork of charts is going to allow us to think of our collection of terms, which is manifold-like in some sense, as like whatever the topology that we're using to locate the points, right? But this topology is no longer Hausdorff. Does that make sense? So it's not like yeah.
I'm sort of lost, but
so again, we started with a collection of terms over which we imposed a collection of formulae that give you a topology on that collection of terms. So that structure there is playing in the role of the manifold. Okay, and now we come along with a collection of contexts. So, and it turns out that we can describe this collection of contexts as a, my puppy was away for the weekend and she's now returning. So I'm about to face a certain amount of noise and chaos. My apologies. Anyway, the idea is that this collection of arrow formulae, right? So implications, think of them as, if that helps. This collection of implications, those are just formula, right? And I can plug. Yeah. Hey, thanks, man. I appreciate it. That's okay. I got a bunch more.
Okay. Yeah, she had it when we were on the way to our car, and then she didn't when we were in the car. So it's like,
no worries. No worries. Don't worry about it. Well, thank you. You have a. Oh, thank you. Yeah. See you Thursday. Perfect. Thank you, man. So sorry about the interruption, guys. So now we have this collection of implication formulae, and though when you have an implication formula, that's really a one-hold context. And once you have one of these one-hold contexts, that gives you the ability to locate terms, right? So a one-hold context together with a term is now a location. So now we have points and their locations. Is this making sense, Jim? Does that help?
Yep, that's I get it. I understand it so far, and then I get lost. I'm getting old.
No worries, no worries. Okay. So then the next step is you want to talk about what overlap means. So overlap for a couple of arrows means that they share the same source. And so, but now we just have this collection of implication formulae. We didn't impose any conditions on them, right? It's just a collection of implications. And what are we going to do? Well, we're now going to impose some conditions that that whenever you have these overlaps, that the union, or the disjunction of the targets, has to be the source of some implication, right? So that gives you your different, that gives you the analog of your differentiability. So that's what I'm driving at. Before it gets a lot more complicated, right? Once we start trying to build up a notion of connection, it's going to be hard to, stay with the program, to build up tangent bundles and all of those things, unless you can kind of have in your mind how all of these pieces fit together. But this is where we're going. We're going to build up an analog of, so again, the manifold together with the atlas structure is the beginning. And then you build a notion of tangent bundles, so tangents to the space at every point. And that's going to allow you to have a way to measure curvature and other kinds of things. And then to move to the Cartan generalization, right? You want to talk about being able to move these around, sort of moving frames, and that's going to give you the machinery to be able to talk about relativity or relativistic-like structures. And so what we want to do, so the ultimate goal here is we want to build, we've sort of transported the intuition so far up through the atlas structure into this logical setting. So in the same way that Steve Vickers began to talk about, topology via logic, we want to talk about geometry via logic. That's kind of the idea. And we've built up just the beginning of the ingredients to characterize the Klein and Cartan program in terms of this logical representation. And the main insight is that we're not using the notion of location that comes from the real line or the real numbers. We're using a notion of location that comes from this idea of splitting terms into a context and a subterm. And what we've shown is that we can paint over a topology on terms with a bunch of one-hole contexts, and that those one-hole contexts are giving us an atlas-like structure. And where we would like to go is to build up a notion of a connection. But it's going to be really hard to understand or follow the notion of connection until we're comfortable with the analogy so far. So please, if anyone has any questions, and we can do that, we don't have to do this all today. And in fact, I'm not sure that I want to go much further than this analogy so far today. So let's see if anyone has any questions about the infrastructure that we're building up.
So I'm visualizing multiple programs as abstract syntax trees.
Yes.
And in these multiple programs, we have, these programs are like redexes because they cannot be, they have holes, so we cannot reduce it anymore. So, and then...
So the programs, so we start with a collection of programs and they're complete programs, no holes. And then we're gonna paint over them with context that have holes, and you plug the programs into the holes, and then you get potentially new programs that can either reduce or essentially that can reduce. Does that make sense?
So when you say paint over, so I have a question. Do you think about reductions when you transferring programs to manifolds, or now you not think about that? You just you're just trying to connect locations where where you want to create these holes.
Okay, so that's a very good question, and that really helps to clarify the construction. So I have a bunch of programs. Some of them may be redexes, and some of them might not be. And I have a bunch of contexts, right? And the idea is that I'm
from where you have context?
They're just a part of the structure. In the same way that these charts, they're part of the input. They're part of the description of the atlas. They're given. You don't have an atlas unless you give the charts, right? You don't compute them. They're handed to you as a part of the data.
Oh, I see.
So likewise, the contexts are handed to us as a part of the data. And whenever you have a pair that's a context in a program, you now have a location, right? So essentially,
so this is our input. We want to process this information.
That's right. That input is describing the analog of an atlas.
Yes, this makes sense.
Okay, cool,
Yes,
cool. Yeah. And so you know, it's hard to check right now that we've got the analog of the differentiability condition correct. That will come about when we start putting more of the pieces together. So when we start building up a notion of connection and those kinds of things. But I want to shift gears a little bit and remind people of what I was trying to say before, right? So I've said many times in this context and on RCAST that there's something funny about science, the way science has been constructed. So the funny thing is, if you look at the mathematical account of physics, there is no notion of agency, right? So you don't talk about the why of planets revolving in a gravitational field, right? So the planets moving around the sun, you don't say there's no purpose to that, right? The planets don't have agency. They're just following the equations of motion that are dictated by general relativity. That's it. There's no purpose. There's no agency in that. By the time you get to biological structures, it is almost impossible to not talk about why when you talk about like immunological immune systems, right? The purpose of the immune system is to defend the organization from bacterial and viral infections, right? It's that there's a functional why. there's a notion of agency, and that's that the idea that you have to climb levels of complexity to get to agency, I think is backwards. I want to argue that agency must be baked in from the bottom up. You have to be able to talk about autonomous agency in the mathematics at the very bottom level before you start to have a convincing account of the physical world, the physical sciences. So this is my proposal. Now, it could be wrong. It could be, wrong-headed, and I'm open to discussions of that kind. But my proposal is the math of physics and chemistry and other disciplines is missing this fundamental capability. Now, one of the most interesting things of all is when you move into the realm of computation, it is next to impossible not to begin to talk about agency. You have to, it's much easier to talk about the agency of a program. And in fact, I would argue that one of the biggest things that smart contracts have that make them distinct from legal contracts is that smart contracts have agency. Smart contracts can do things on their own. A contract is just a legal agreement. A legal contract is just a legal agreement between two parties. The contract itself does not have any agency whatsoever. It has to be executed by the parties involved. But a smart contract is not like that. It has its own agency. In particular, a judge may make some ruling, some order that is simply impossible to carry out because the program has cryptographic agency that is impossible to break. And this completely changes the entire landscape, right? Because how do you adjudicate in a world where you have agents that have, cryptographically unbreakable actions? Is that making sense?
That makes a lot of sense to me.
Yes.
Great. Okay, great. So now, once we have this idea of agency, then what we don't want to do is we don't want to be woo-woo. We don't want to lose track of all of the nice, wonderful mathematical tools that we've built up. So I'm not trying in any way to let go of rigor or predictability to the extent that you can have it, or theory testing or any of that. So the reason I'm going about this research program is because if I can build up a notion of the mathematics of physics on top of something that already has agency baked in, then I can say, look, all of your intuitions could be transported over to this setting, but I now don't have to look for agency at these upper levels of complexity. Agency was always there from the beginning. Does this make sense? Are people following what I'm saying?
Well, it looks like the ancient Greek arguing Aristotle and Platon about where the ideas came from. Are they already present, or are they crafted by people? So this touches lots of areas: psychology, philosophy, all that stuff. So at least from I'm not really truly understand the intention of overall program, but it looks like from what I hear, it's like trying to answer the main question on the earth.
Oh, no. I mean, there's many more questions than this. All I'm doing is saying, look, if we were to take seriously the idea, Wheeler's idea, that you could get physics arising from computation, right? That's well. So John Wheeler, you know, very famous physicist, worked in general relativity and not other areas. But his argument was we ought to be able to get it arising from bit. But he didn't have the computational chops to carry that out, because he started work on that program towards the end of his life, and just didn't have the computational chops. Also at that time, you know, the pi calculus was just coming online and really beginning to see this idea of autonomous agency as something that we could talk about rigorously mathematically. That didn't come into focus until after the pi calculus. That's really something we're thinking about, right? We didn't have a mathematical apparatus to talk about agency, autonomous agency, until the pi calculus.
Yeah, Wheeler called it the participatory universe, and it goes back to the measurement problem, where
Yes.
I can move my hand to the left or the right. And if I try to apply the laws of physics to figure out which way I'm going to move it, it's not going to, I'm not going to get the right answer.
Yes.
But,
Yeah. Yep.
No, it's like, where does the autonomy start? I mean, is this, you know, Wheeler thought more it was a matter of consciousness or human consciousness, whereas it's got to be down lower than that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. So I'm arguing that we can have all kinds of rigorous notions of autonomous agency, and this is why the mobile process calculi are so foundationally important, because they allow us to talk about autonomous agency without yet having to tackle consciousness. Don't have to do it, right? We have the notions of bisimulation, substitutability, and the connection between bisimulation and logic. All of that allows us to have a rigorous handle on autonomous agency. And now what we do is we build on top of that notions of topology and geometry. That's the basic idea. So I can carry out the programs that were so effective in terms of geometry. Like, I can carry all of that out, but I do so in a setting where I already have a mathematics that is available to me to reason about autonomous agency. And as I climb higher levels of complexity, you know, I go from geometry to physics, I go from physics to chemistry, from chemistry to biology. That agency, the ability to think about agency was already there from the beginning.
You know, the part that you're doing this without touching consciousness was like, now I got what you're saying.
Yes. Yeah. I don't have to tackle any of those hard problems. I get to tackle, you know, some very, very challenging problems, right? You know, can I transport the intuitions of Klein, Cartan, Einstein over into this setting? Now, that's all really hard, right? And it seemed like, I have to say, back in the 90s, when I was beginning to think about these things, it seemed really daunting. And the reason it seemed really daunting was like this basic mismatch, right? The computation does not enjoy the same kinds of separation properties from a topological perspective that the reals and Hausdorff spaces do, right? You know, like they're not even T1 in terms of separability. So trying to, the idea of building a geometry on top of that seems impossible. But by the same token, you know, it seemed impossible that we would have a model of the lambda calculus, right? Because cardinality arguments seem to completely undermine this possibility. You know, so with the lambda calculus, you need a domain that's isomorphic to its own function space. But we know that the function space, you know, if I have some domain D, the function space D to D is going to have cardinality of D to cardinality of D, right? So how could cardinality of D equal cardinality of D to the cardinality of D? That's just, you can't, there's no number that makes that work except one, right? So are all models of the lambda calculus trivial? But it turns out that Dana Scott has this insight. He says, no, we're not looking at all the functions, we're only looking at the computable ones. And as soon as you only look at the computable ones, then you whack down the cardinality of the function space. And suddenly that isomorphism is possible again. So similarly here, the insight is, no, this idea of locating things only using the reals is a mistake. There's another way to think about location, and it is it's crisp and you know, has good properties, and with that notion of location, we can begin to transport a lot more of the geometric ideas. All right, so we're very near the top of the hour, so we can leave it here and head over to Dev Stand-Up. I really appreciate your guys' attention in this, and yeah, more to come.
Very good. Thank you, Greg. We appreciate it.
Thanks
you
for all this visualization.
Yeah,
Yeah, it was great. Yeah.
All right, cheers.
Right. Bye.